Hallo zusammen, Hao. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone in Germany and in China. My name is Thomas Willems. I'm the German Vice Director of the Chinese-German School for Postgraduate Studies at Tongji-University. On behalf of the German Academic Exchange Service, I warmly welcome you to our third German-Chinese dialogue, Metamorphosis, Science Meets Art in the Age of the Anthropocene. The idea of this dialogues is to bring students, scholars, and artists, and also interested people from both countries and cultures into a conversation so that they can discuss important questions about climate change, its consequences, and solutions. Our topic today is, of course, again, water. Water as a resource of life with global challenges and local solutions. First, we will hear a lecture of Professor LI Fengting, the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Environmental Science and Engineering at Tongji-University. He will give us some insights into the potential of triangular cooperation between Germany, China, and Africa in the field of water management. And after Professor Li, then we will hear Professor Jörg Niewöhner, the director of the Integrative Research Institute on Transformations of Human Environment Systems, IRI THESys, at Humboldt-University of Berlin. Professor Niewöhner will talk about hydrosocial territories and ask the question, what is water for whom? After the lectures, the two scientists have the opportunity to comment on the other's lecture and to ask each other some questions. You as an audience can write some comments or questions in the chat at any time, and our experts will try to answer it during our open discussion. With the end of the discussion, this German-Chinese dialogue is officially over, which will take about 1 hour. But if you have the time and the interest, you are welcome to watch the experimental short film by the renowned Chinese avant-garde director SU Xiaogangzu. This film is a 37 minutes film based on the Medea myth, which has been relocated to a new cultural context and interprets the story with an anthropocentric approach. The film was exclusively produced for our dialogue series and mainly sponsored by the German Academic Exchange Service, which also financed the entire dialogue series. At this point, many thanks for that. We organized this online dialogue series in cooperation with the Theater of the Anthropocene of the Humboldt-University in Berlin that will be briefly introduced to you now by its artistic director, Frank Radatz. Frank.
Yeah, hello, everybody. The Theater of Anthropocene was founded last year at the Humboldt-University in order to deal with ecological issues on an aesthetic level. Anthropologe is the director of the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, which is an institute which organizes explorations of the Arctic or deep sea exploring, was founding this theater with me, a long-time theater person, to and we embody the collaboration, how to say, between science and art on a personal level. Thanks to Sabine Kunz, the president of the Humboldt-University, it was possible to establish this ambitious theater at the Humboldt-University and to have this context with the scientists, and we organize on the other side artists from all over the world to collaborate in this field of science and art. This approach is also reflected in the structure of this dialogue format. The presentation by German and Chinese researchers will be specially developed for the format and embedded in an artistic contribution from both countries. Today, we have some movie from scenes from the director Su, and we experience with many aesthetic forms in the course of the project.
In this Chinese-German dialogue, scientists and artists from both countries enter into an exchange on ecological and social issues in the age of the Anthropocene. And characteristic of this new geological age is the end of the stable climate conditions as we know them from the Holocene, the climate regime that has ruled for around 10,000 years. As you probably know, these ecological changes have been caused by the worldwide activities of the human species. And at the center of our dialogue series is the element of water, which is an indispensable and highly changeable raw material that has also inspired the art and thinking of cultures. Last time we discussed the role of water and the sea in the history of literature and philosophy. Today we want to turn to very recent topics regarding the element of water. Water is an important natural resource, and it is a fundamental condition of life. So we have named today's dialogue, Water, a Resource of Life. Today, we want to focus on specific challenges, problems, and also solutions regarding water on a global as well as on a local scale.
Now we start with Professor LI Fengting's lecture, Potential of Triangular Cooperation of Germany, China, Africa in the Field of Water Management. But first, I would like to briefly introduce Professor Li. Professor Li has received his PhD from the School of Chemistry and Chemical Engineering at Nanjing University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Tongji-University and the University of Georgia. Since 1999, he is professor at the School of Environmental Science and Engineering of Tongji-University. And from 2001 to 2002, Professor Li was visiting scientist at the Free University of Berlin, and in 2011 at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Since 2004, Professor Li has been Vice Director at the Tongji Institute for Environment and Sustainable Development, and he's also Vice Dean at the Faculty of Environmental Science and Technology. Furthermore, Professor Li is the coordinator for the South Cooperation and China Affairs of the United Nations Environment Programme since 2014. In this function, Professor Li was honored an UN prize due to his significant contribution to the China-Africa cooperation on the safe water supply technology transfer. So, Professor Li, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you here and to share your experiences and insight with us today. So thank you very much for your participation, and the screen is yours. Muss Mikro an, ne? Oder? Ah ja, perfekt.
Thank you very much, Dr. William. Guten Tag for everyone. I'm sorry, also I stayed in Berlin for more than 1 year, but I cannot speak in German. Today I will introduce the water issue for the cooperation between China, Germany, and the Africa countries. As Vincent and William, you mentioned about the importance of the water. So it's the essential of the life. I will divide my presentation in 4 parts. And first, I will introduce the water issue in China in the past 40 years. And then the cooperation between China and Germany. Later, we will discuss the water issue in African countries. I think this is the map of China. You can see in the blue and in the green, it's the south of China or east part of China. The figure explains the precipitation of the rain. So you can find in the South China, we have a lot of water. We have a lot of rain. In the South China, the coverage is about 40%, but we have more than 80% of the fresh water. But in the north and in the northwest, we have a scarcity of the water. So the distribution of the water is very different from the north, from east to the west China. And in the north in China, you can see that here is the Beijing city. In the North China, we have a scarcity of the water resource. So we have to transport. We use the canal to transport the water from the South China to the north, to Beijing, Tianjin, and Tangshan, and other cities from the south. Here is the Yangtze River. The Yangtze River is the biggest river in China. The capacity is about 900 billion cubic meter fresh water a year. So in the south, we have abundant fresh water, but in the north, we don't have a lot of fresh water. So that's the big challenge for China. Even in the northwest, we have a scarcity of the water in Xinjiang and in Gansu area. So in the past 70 years, we have observed the quick urbanization in China. You can see the figure. From 1949, there is less people live in the city. But now, in the past 2 years, in 2008, more than 75 people live in the city. So in the past 40 years, every year we have 10 million people. They were moved from rural area to the city area. So in the city, we have a lot of issue for the water scarcity, for the water pollution, soil pollution. So we have some problem, especially in the past 40 years. We see the quick industrialization in China. So the challenge is much bigger. Here you can see the figure. The dark blue, this curve means the growth of the GDP in China after 1999, about 20 years ago. So the GDP, the economy grows quickly. But in China, we have a very strict rule to control the consumption of fresh water. Here is the industry water consumption here. Also in the past 20 years, we have a very good economy. The economy grows quickly, but the demand, the consumption of the fresh water is very stable. So for this, we have done a lot of research. But I mentioned, first, we have some problem for the pollution of lakes and the rivers. So we have some lessons for the deterioration. Here is the figure from the state report on surface water quality in 2019. In China, we classify the surface water into 5, class 1, class 2, and class 3. So that's the class 1 is the best water. Class 2 is good. Class 3 is well. So if the water in class 1, 2, 3, so we can take the water as a water resource for tap water, for the life. But if the water falling in class 4, fine, or worse than fine, so we cannot take it as the resource of tap water. You can see class 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This area, that's only about 70%. That's 75%. So we can use it for our tap water. The left 25%, we cannot use it as the resource of the forest, as the tap water. So we have the problem of the deterioration of the surface water. This figure, I think maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the percentage of class 4, 5, and less worse than 5, the percentage is much bigger. As in the past years, everyone from the public, they know the value of the nature. So the protection for the environmental, for the ecology, awareness is increasing quickly. And 10 years ago, the central government will value the work for the governor, for the mayor, by the economy, by the GDP. No, it's different. From the central government, they will value the work for the mayor, for the governor, by the ecology and the environmental issues. This is very important. This is very different from 10 years ago. Here I show you, so I mentioned in the past 40 years, China has made the economic miracle. The economy gets better and better, but in the past years, we have some problem for the pollution for the rivers and lakes. And in some lake and river, you can see the eutrophication for some area, even for some lakes. And the lake, we have to take the fresh water as the tap water. And in some city, we also have the problem for the air pollution in some city, especially in the winter, in the North China. And in China, we have about more than 600 cities. They have the shortage of the water resource. So about 5 years ago, from the central government, we promote, enhance green development. Green development is the priority of China. The quality growth of the economy is a priority. So from the central government, they have to evaluate the governor, the mayor by the ecology and the environmental issue. So the environmental issue is the same important as the GDP or economy. So this is different from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the priority is the economy. We have to solve the problem of the poverty. We have to solve the problem of the food. So from the central government, we have the strategy. We will enhance innovation for the new technology for the water issues. We have to coordinate the use and consumption from different city, different area. And for example, in the North China, we have the scarcity of the water. We will not promote the heavy industry, which will use a lot of fresh water. And for every city, the environmental protection and the ecology protection is a priority. So in China, from the central government to the mayor, to the governor, they are open for the international cooperation. We hope we can share the experience with other countries, and we can learn from other countries from them for their advanced technology, from American, from Germany, from Japan. By this, we can sharing our experience and lessons with other developing countries. For some country in ASEAN, in Africa, in South America. I think I'm very impressed for the economy and the ecosystem in Germany when I was in Germany about 20 years ago. So I think the green economy strategy for Germany is very successful. So it's very helpful for the development of China. For the urbanization management, we can learn from Germany. For Tongji-University, it's very special to Germany, as the Tongji is a window to Germany. More than 100 years ago, it's Dr. Paul. He established Tongji-University. In 1978, China took the policy to open to Western countries. So the former chancellor, Mr. Kohl, visited Tongji-University. So Tongji-University is a very important window to German university and other institutions. By this window, we hope we have more cooperation. In the past, after 1978, from the central government, they have signed more than 40 agreements with the federal government of Germany to promote the water protection and the water consumption efficiency in China. It's our honor. 20 years ago, we invited Dr. Klaus Töpfer to be the honor professor, and he can teach in Tongji-University and promote the cooperation for Tongji-University with other universities in Germany. Here are some picture for the signing, for the visiting from President and the Chancellor to China. So in China, I think the pollution for the water issue is in the city is a big challenge. So for the university, for both sides, we can work on the water, we can promote the water management efficiency. For example, how to treat the tap water, and we hope the tap water can reach the criteria of European standard, how to promote the reuse of the green water, and how to reduce the black water in the river. And in China, the solid waste for the industry and for the municipal is also a big challenge. For example, in Shanghai, we have a new policy for the municipal waste. We have to incinerate it to reduce the volume. In Germany, you have a lot of new technology. We can introduce the technology in Shanghai and in other cities to promote the reuse of the solid waste. Here, I will introduce the water issue in African countries. I think 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, the water situation in some cities is very similar to African countries. Here is the in African countries, they have the quick urbanization and the quick growth of population. In some cities, they have the shortage of fresh water. And for some cities, the population grows quickly, and it's up to 2 to 3% every year. So the population grows quickly. And in some big cities, the level of the economy is not so good. In the red, some people live in the slum. They cannot access to the tap water. They don't have the sanitary facility at home. I remember about 40 years ago, I live in Shandong province, in the capital city, in Jinan. I share a small room with my parents. we don't have the tap water. We don't have the private sanitary facility at home. This is very similar to the current situation in some African countries. But after 40 years, we have a big change in China. This is the access for the tap water in African countries. By this figure, you can see for some city, they have less access to the tap water, less than 40% in some city. And in other cities, in some country, Egypt and some country, they have very high access of the tap water. This is the sanitation facility in some African countries. This figure is come from the inhabited in some, for example, in South Sudan. The people they have the less 10%. The population they can access to the sanitation facility, and in South Africa, in Egypt, this percentage is very high. So there is a big change. There is a big potential to promote the tap water, the sanitation facility in African countries. So China, in the past 40 years, we have done very well for the economy. We have our experience. We hope we can help African countries. However, for Germany is an industrialized country. You have a very bad experience for the urbanization, for the city management, for the water sanitation management. So I think the triangle cooperation is much more helpful for African countries, for them to fight climate change, to fight the shortage of water issue. So I think as the area of African countries, it's about 3,000, that's about 30 million square kilometer for African countries. The population is 1.3 billion people. In the future, they have a big growth of demand of the industry articles. They have a big demand of the apartment rooms. So they have a big demand of fresh water. So I think for African countries, they have to follow the green urbanization and the green industrialization. So Germany is the best model to follow. And China is between African country and Germany. So for the triangle cooperation is very important for African countries. As the African country is very important in the past 20 years, I have been to African country for more than 50 times. I also worked in Nairobi for more than 1 year. So I think African country is very important. Africa, they have a special culture. It's a pillar, it's very important for African countries. They have in the politics, as in African country, there are 54 countries in the world at UN. They play a very important role. And in African country, more than 70% of the people are young people. So they have a huge human resource. And in African countries, they have enough natural resource to explore, to support their good life and good future. So in the south of Sahara Desert, most of the country, the economy gets better and better. So for the economy, African country will play a very important role. So I think African country is a pillar of culture, a pillar of politics, a pillar of human resource, a pillar of natural resource, a pillar of economy. Last month, China established a China-Africa Environmental Research Center in Beijing last month. So we hope we can share our technology experience with African countries. So I hope Germany, university, industry can join the hands with China and the African country to fight climate change, to fight the water shortage in African countries. So that's my presentation about the cooperation between China, Germany, Africa countries. Vielen Dank. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much, Professor Li, for your very interesting presentation. We will talk about it a little bit later. And I think now we will come to our second presentation by Professor Jörg Niewöhner, Hydro-Social Territories, What is Water for Whom? And Vincent will introduce Professor Niewöhner.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Document has vanished. I don't know why. So I have to improvise, but that's okay. Professor Niewöhner is the director of the IRI THESys. As you have already said in the introduction, Thomas, the IRI THESys is a very special research institute of the Humboldt-University because it is very interdisciplinary and deals with ecological topics by paying attention to natural sciences as well as to social sciences and humanities. There's a lot of international cooperation of the IRI THESys, and it's, I think, an outstanding research institute of the Humboldt-University. Frank, do you want to continue?
You're muted still, Frank, I think.
Yeah.
In case you are talking.
Okay, sorry. Professor Niewöhner himself is an environmental scientist as well as an anthropologist. So his research also leaves the ground of this traditional separation between natural and social science. As a professor for European ethnology, he's especially interested in the field of human environmental relationships, a topic that will be, so far I understand, also elaborate on his today's presentation. I hereby want to pass the word to Professor Niewöhner. We are very glad for having you with us today. The stage is yours, Professor Niewöhner.
Yeah, thanks very much, Frank and Vincent. Thanks very much for the kind invitation and for making this happen. I think it's we talk so at European and American universities we talk a lot about China. It's nice to talk with Chinese colleagues for a change. That's got to be a good thing. So thanks for that. Thanks also to Professor Li for this great presentation. Very interesting. And my talk, although it's completely different, probably links to it in the question of kind of the challenges that await us and African people, mostly, I guess, whoever us is, in the context of water management. What I want to do, and I hope I can do this as briefly as possible, is explain why what is water for whom is a sensible question to ask, because I guess in many ways that's a very stupid question to ask because we know what water is and that's the problem solved, right? So if you go with Professor Li, then there's a clear understanding of what water is, and the problem is how we manage it. And what I want to do is, if I can move, here we go, is sort of turn into a problem our sort of implicit scientific understanding of what water is and talk about water as relational, explain how this is a very modern, in a European sense. So it'd be interesting to discuss what this looks like from a Chinese, or more generally speaking, Asian perspective. How our understanding of water that seems to be self-evident is a very modern abstraction. And then very briefly relate to an ongoing research project in Colombia, in Latin America, to show how kind of this problematization of what water is changes the way we conduct our research, and how that challenges water management or water governance. So that's where it links to Professor Li. I don't really have an example as yet from the Colombian work, because it's been delayed, unfortunately, by Corona and our inability to travel. But I think you get the gist nevertheless. So what's water? Really, in many ways, as I said, is a stupid question, right? Because we all know what water is. It's first and foremost a chemical entity, H2O. So there's not much to say about this. Most people across the globe these days will probably share that that's one thing that water is. Many people would probably assume that that's the only thing. But of course, as Vincent said in the introduction, this is called water as a resource for life. So that already asks now, well, what's that got to do with H2O? And of course, the second dominant view is that very commonly across the globe these days, we treat water as a resource, right? Or as a commodity. It's a good that is treated like most other goods, right? You can discuss whether it should be in public or in private ownership. I probably have to, it's like a weather presenter here. So if I bend down, this is Hydro Sogamoso, the dam, hydroelectric dam, and I'll come back to that in Colombia that we are working on. So water is a resource. It can be traded, it's an asset, it can be speculated on, it can be transferred, as we saw in the case of China, it can be channeled. So it's treated as a resource, as a thing, it's commodified. And of course, from a Euro-American perspective, that goes hand in hand with the capitalist understanding of ownership, of profit making, and of the distribution of revenue from water. And even if it's in public ownership, much of the public ownership management is still sort of very corporatist, at least in Western countries. But this is really, I would argue, the prevalent understanding of what water is across the globe. But of course, there's another one. This, let me just get out of the way. This is this is not very practical, is it? This is Josephine Mandermin, grandmother and elder Josephine Mandermin, I should say, of the Anishinaabe group, or the Anishinaabekwe in North America, in Canada. And there's a very, very interesting movement among the First Nations people and the Native Americans of North America, but also, and I will see this in Colombia, also in Latin America. So across the Americas, there's a number of indigenous understandings of water that are fundamentally different from water as a resource. The short version for sort of Westerners or non-indigenous people is that they treat water as lifeblood. And what that really means is that for them, and especially for women in these groups, water is, and this is why resource of and for life is a good title, for them, water is a life-giving resource that is very, very closely connected to a number of spiritual systems and beliefs. This is very, very hard to understand for the Western mind, right? We can sort of think, well, that's a nice bit of folklore and nice belief system to have, but really it's still H2O, right? And we can then debate whether we can trade it. But the point is here that it's knowledge that is very, very deeply embedded in local practices, in a local belief system, in the kind of kinship systems and sort of the cultural practices of groups of people in particular places. And what Josephine Mandermin did as a means of sort of taking care of water and entering into a form of stewardship, which I think is quite amazing. She started the Mother Earth, what's now called the Great Lakes, but it was originally called the Mother Earth Water Walks in 2003. And what she did is she took a copper bucket, if you like, filled with a little bit of water, and she walked around the lakes that are in the territory. And these are the Great Lakes of North America, right? So just to show, she walked around Lake Superior with this copper water bucket, sort of spreading and taking in new water at the contributaries, etc. Here we can see this. The shoreline of Lake Superior is a little over 4,300 kilometers. So that's quite a bit of a walk for an elderly lady. And not only did she do that, but she and a larger group walked around all the Great Lakes. So until she died in 2016, I think, I'm not quite sure now, she walked over 17,000 kilometers as a means of raising awareness for a different understanding of what water is. The important thing here is, I think, twofold. For one thing, there's the thematic issue of water as life-giving and water having a spirit, which is difficult to understand and does not readily compare with the sort of scientific abstract understanding of what water is. Although none of these people are in any sense, or most of these people, which I don't want to generalize, are not anti-scientific in any way, right? They help investing in water treatment plants, they support dam projects, but only in ways that are compatible with the way they live water. So one thing is water as having a spirit and water as life-giving, being totally differently sort of related to other areas of life and not being disconnected as a resource only. The other one is that knowledge of water is really a skill. So their argument is, if you don't do the walking, you don't get it, right? So you can, as Westerners, like I do now, we can repeat this, but really it doesn't mean much unless you sort of align yourself or you get involved with such people's everyday lives. So with grandmother Mandamines or others, there's other people doing these walks now, and you can get involved if you want to understand what water means to them. So what we have here, we call this in anthropology a relational ontology, because water is not something essential, but it's related, it's defined by its relations into kinship, into spiritual matters, into exchange practices, and into everyday life. So very different from abstracting it as a resource. Now, the main reason here, you can see grandmother Mandamine on her walk, and you can see the bucket. So it's not all glorious, right? It's the side of a road. There's easier things to do. I think it's important to recognize that the main reason why we we as Euro-Americans, but particularly Europeans now, the reason why we don't understand, or why we have difficulties of understanding and following different ontologies of water, is because, of course, with the colonial and capitalist expansion of from the 16th century onwards, we have essentially, well, they talk about epistemicide rather than genocide. We have essentially killed off any other kind of knowledge, but supposedly universal scientific knowledge. Interesting thing about this, and we could talk about this, is that this is a very Euro-American reading of colonialization that doesn't tie up very well with Asian countries, neither with China, I guess, and its own history of colonial exchanges with the British, I guess, largely, but also Japan and Korea, particularly Japan as a major colonizer in the region. So what I'm saying here comes from a Euro-American understanding of global history and the expansion of colonialism. So really, what's happened is that we used to have multiple understandings of water, but we've reduced them to a modern understanding, which comes from the kind of the universal knowledge of a few countries that dominate the Western university. And what we are arguing now, and this is my whole point really, and it's simple but difficult to translate into research, is we need to recognize again these multiple ontologies of water, especially when we engage in global projects such as the UN Environmental Programme or the Commission on Biodiversity or Climate Change, right? These are international programs that are hitting the local ground somewhere with a very different set of understandings and practices of water. And the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro has argued in this context for what he calls ontological anarchy. So don't go into these contexts knowing what water is, but go in there being open to different ontologies. And it's by no means certain that the scientific representation of water is the dominant one. So there's a lot of work, and this I guess fits nicely here. There's a lot of work with artists and all kinds of artistic practices to represent different understandings and different practices of water other than scientific. Now, and I'm already coming to the final part, what does that mean for hydrosocial territories in our own work? Now, hydrosocial territories, which stem as a notion that stems from this sort of relational ontology, relational thinking, hydrosocial territories have been defined as the socially, naturally, and politically constituted spaces that are recreated or created and recreated through the interactions amongst human practices, cultural practices, etc., walking around lakes, for example, water flows, hydraulic technologies, biophysical elements, socioeconomic structures, and cultural political institutions. So it takes what Professor Lee talked about, which I guess is mainly water flows, hydraulic technologies, and socioeconomic structures, and expands it into local social and cultural practices and cultural and political institutions. And what this approach of hydrosocial territories allows us to do is to look in a particular space how territories fight or compete, I should probably say, most often compete for dominance in a local area. So some people might like to set up sustainable, like Professor Lee was saying now, green and sustainable, economically viable, but green and sustainable hydrosocial territories. Others might look for extractivist and sort of commodified territories. Again, others might be looking for indigenous hydrosocial territories. And these different kinds of territories are competing within a region for who gets to shape the territory, the space out there, the landscape, the infrastructure, and the kind of practices that are dominant. Now, we are taking, at the moment, this approach to Colombia. And Colombia, a very sort of biodiverse and ethnically very heterogeneous, very beautiful country. And all these blue dots here are major dam, multi-purpose dams. Of course, plenty of those in China and across the world. Dams are probably, together with nuclear power stations and other parts of this sort of mega infrastructure projects of economic and social development. And they're often in many ways problematic because, of course, they've displaced people. They're a major disruption of social ecological systems. While benefiting a lot of people, they also cause a lot of trouble in many cases. And we've picked for our Colombia project that I just wanted to very briefly point to in closing here. We've picked 3 of the dams, Ura, Hidro Sogamosa, and Betania Quimbo, that are all problematic in their own ways. Ura being quite old from the early 1990s, Hidro Sogamosa and Betania Quimbo already older. You can see some of the quotes here from this Environmental Justice Atlas. Just to give you an idea, I'm sure you've all seen these. This is Hidro Sogamosa. You know what dams look like. This is Ura in Colombia. These are major infrastructure projects, and this is Quimbo. And what we are doing, and unfortunately we haven't advanced enough to present results here, but I guess it's enough to understand how we're proceeding and how that's probably different from sort of established water governance. We're looking at these dams, especially in the post-construction phase. Most people look at this when they're being built and they're looking at the resistance of local people, et cetera, et cetera. We are monitoring these dams in their post-construction phase as part of the Colombian peace process, right? With the FARC guerrillas in the peace process. It's a very, very fragile situation in rural Colombia. And what we're looking at is water governance at 4 different levels. So we're looking at the displacement of people and the effects on livelihoods. That's ethnographic fieldwork. We're looking at the reconfiguration of water flows, so hydrological and ecological effects. That's largely quantitative modeling. We're looking at the kind of description or the inscriptions in technology. So what was the purpose of the dam building? That's archival work. And that's largely German technology, to be fair, exported to Colombia as so often. So we can see about how this will work in Africa, of course. We're looking at the distribution of benefits from selling the electricity from these dams. That's basically market modeling, etc. So an economic approach. And we're trying to integrate these. We call this situated modeling, and that's my final point. There's different ways of doing this. The way we approach this is sort of a form of reflexive quantification. So we try to quantify effects as much as possible to make them visible in a certain way. But at the same time, we try to reflect on these quantifications to make clear what they exclude. For example, a lot of local and indigenous ontologies. And so we're trying to widen the kind of the standard set of representations. This is usually a participatory process that we are in the process of setting up now. So to get local stakeholders involved, which is quite a laborious process. And what we're trying to do is, this is the last point here, is move from epistemological pluralism, so putting these different perspectives next to each other, to letting them talk to each other. And what that means is that we take, in the ideal form, we don't just sort of narrate indigenous perspectives, but we take these perspectives together with the people, so to speak. We involve people in traditional hydrological modeling. So rather than doing the modeling from a Western perspective only, which we pretend is universal, we take indigenous perspectives and bring local people on board with a very, very different set of priorities, values, understandings of nature and of water, and get them involved in this modeling process and see how that works. And sometimes that works very well, and the model comes out with different results. And sometimes it doesn't work well because people don't feel that they can articulate their concerns in these kinds of models. So to link it back to Professor Li's presentation, what we're trying here is, yes, we are going into a lot of collaborations and cooperations between Global North and Global South, and we'd be very interested to go into this triangular projects that Professor Li has pointed to. But we're interested to making visible the kind of the local heterogeneity and not assume that the answers sit on the engineering side, so to speak, on the kind of technological and economic side. And that's, of course, makes this a much slower process. It's a lot of international organizations like in UNEP are recognizing this now as indigenous knowledge. But of course, in practical terms, it's very, very difficult to conduct these processes so everyone feels represented. So with that little glimpse into our work, I thank you very much for your attention, and we can enter into discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is your part to take over, Frank. You have to switch on your mic. Otherwise, we cannot hear you.
I have the same problem with my mic. Okay, thank you very much, Jörg, for your presentation. Now we can start with the expert dialogue. And I ask you, Professor Li, and you, Jörg, Professor Niewöhner, whether you have any comments or questions on the lecture of each other.
Would you like to go first, Professor Li?
Oh, well. I wait for some comments from you, from the audience. Okay.
Yeah, we thought maybe that first you can discuss with each other as like a kind of an expert talk, and also the audience has the opportunity to type questions into the chat, which we will then forward later. But maybe first you or Professor Niewöhner starts.
Should I kick us off with a question?
Yes, please.
I have a question on before we come to Africa, maybe a question on China. I'd be interested to you've showed the kind of the hydrological maps. And I'd be interested to learn a little bit more about how you expect climate change to affect these maps. We are working ourselves, well, not at the moment because we can't travel, obviously, but we are working in Yunnan province in the southwest. And we seem to be seeing, and we're interested in sort of local agricultural practices and how they adapt with climate change or to climate change knowledge. And it seems to us, of course, that these hydrologic patterns are shifting. More increased volatility of rainfall events, and especially in the border region between the wet and the dry regions, sort of from west to east, this border seems to be shifting. So I wonder whether the main response in China is to transport water, as you presented. So is this mainly a question of infrastructure development, or is there a major change in local practices? Sort of, are you locally adapting with increased water efficiency, different agricultural practices, etc.? Is that something that you're considering, or are you putting your money into technology, so to speak?
Thank you, Professor Jörg. And I mentioned that in China, compared to Germany, the water consumption and the water efficiency is much lower. For example, for the paper mill, for 1 kilo paper production, we will use the water 4 times than Germany factory. So that's a big space to reduce the water consumption for the industry. That's the reason. So China have more cooperation with Germany in the paper industry and the other industry. For example, from Fuite, the German paper mill, they built a factory in China. That's the main problem. Even in the South China, we also have the problem for the city, for the industry. The efficiency of the water consumption is much lower. Even for some city, for some industry, in Shanghai area, the efficiency is lower. The carbon emission is bigger. For example, in Shanghai, on the average emission of CO2 dioxide is bigger than the average data for Germany. So it's unbelievable. So in the short time, I think it's very hard for us to solve the water shortage problem in the North China. So we have to use the Grand Canal and the other rivers to transport the water from south to the north. As the Yangtze River is the biggest water, the fresh water is about 40% of the total fresh water of China from the Yangtze River. So we can use the water from Yangtze River to the north. Yeah, that's the solution in the future 10, 20 years. But the efficiency promotion is the big challenge. That's the saving is a priority for the water issue. Thank you.
Yeah, and there were very impressive figures how you decoupled water use from economic growth. I mean, that's quite a thing to achieve. Does this include agriculture, or are you now talking about the industrial sector?
For the agriculture, China has more cooperation with Israel for the dropping irrigation in the north. In my PPT, there is some picture. They use the dropping irrigation for the desert remediation in the North China, Maowu Desert. The area is about 40,000 square kilometer. 30 years ago, it's a desert. Now it's covered by the forestry now. So we promote this technology widely in the North China, in the Northwest China. Thank you.
Very interesting, thanks. And maybe one more question. You bring other people in, right? Otherwise I just keep asking because I find this interesting. On the African context, now if we were to put this triangulation into action, how do you see the investment happening in Africa? So is this on a loan basis? So is this the idea that there's Chinese investment into the infrastructure and the countries pay the debt off, or how would you implement infrastructure investment from a Chinese perspective?
I think the situation varies differently. Some Chinese company took the construction of the infrastructure sponsored by the World Bank and the other bank from Africa, from European countries. And China also offers a loan for most of African countries to help them to improve the infrastructure facility for the railway, airport, and high-speed way, yeah, and the train, yeah. The situation is different, yeah.
Very interesting.
Okay, at this point, we would like to include the audience in the dialogue, and please ask our experts or give some comments, whatever is seems important for you or questionable.
Yes, please write your comments and questions in the chat function, and let us see if there's any questions so far. Not as I see. So yeah, please feel free to ask anything you like. I think we had a lot of topics we discussed about, from China to Germany, Africa, and both Americas. Oh, there is a question. Oh, Thomas, you want to go first?
I just would like to ask that Professor Niewöhner was very interesting. And how would the cooperation on hydrosocial territories look like with China, in your opinion? You mentioned Yunnan, you have been to Yunnan, but I think it's not, is it a hydrosocial project or?
That's a
in China, for the national criteria for the tap water, as Professor Jörg mentioned, the water is essential for the ecology and for the life of the public. In China, for the city, for the people, we adapt the criteria of China drinking water standard. It's higher than WHO standard, but in the future, I think for some city, most of for the city, the economy level is better. They will adapt similar criteria of drinking water as a European country. So there is a big demand how to improve the drinking water quality. So there's some market for the technology, facility, equipment in China. And sponsored, there are some projects sponsored by German federal government and the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology. There are some ongoing projects about the tap water and wastewater treatment in the city, in Shanghai, Qingdao, and the other cities. Even for the survey about the water quality for the Yangtze River, we have cooperated with some university in Germany, with IRI Research Center, Aachen University, Karlsruhe University. We have cooperated for about 20 years for this. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe I can just add to that. So our work in Yunnan province follows a different approach so far. It looks at local knowledges and how local agriculture knowledge goes together with national level policies in China, and how that takes on board sort of global climate knowledge. So hydrosocial territories are only one small part in this. But I think the interesting thing about the hydrosocial territory, and this is probably also gets to what Gökhan was asking about the kind of the ontologies of water. The interesting thing is that most sort of water infrastructure development projects, also the ones that Professor Lee is describing, and it's the same with inner German or European or American projects, they come with what we call, they are scripted, right? So in the sense that they are implemented in a way that they assume a certain understanding of water, a certain use, a certain population, and a certain environment, right? And what the hydrosocial territories allows us to do, let's look at African examples. You come with a kind of, let's say, a World Bank approach of what water is and how water is supposed to be used, and that then hits local, on the ground, meets local contexts. And this is not only about knowing water differently. That would be an epistemological question, right? How we know water. So do we measure it? Do we experience it? Do we drink it? But it's also what we do with water. So a lot of the, which would then be an ontological question, a lot of the indigenous and native perspectives also in Africa, or in some African countries, I should say, not to generalize too much. A lot of kind of the spiritual side of water is connected to particular practices. And if you're now building a dam or you're introducing certain kinds of tap water in certain ways, then these practices become disrupted. And that causes all sorts of problems in villages, in sort of development, in the generational structure, etc. So it's not that, I'm not saying that you get sort of objection in African villages, West African villages, to clean water technology, right? That that people are not mad, but it's the way that they are implemented that makes a difference, whether to how that disrupts local everyday life, if you like. And what we're trying to do, and it's very hard, is we're trying to open up infrastructure development projects to be more sensitive to these local processes, which is to say, how can you build a dam or bring a pipeline and canal system, install a drinking water, a purification plant? How can you do that in such a way that it works together with local belief systems and local practices? And sort of indigenous peoples are only the most extreme example. In many ways, you can go, if you leave Berlin and you go to Brandenburg, you're already meeting a lot of people that think about and sort of act on the world very, very differently. And of course, China being a huge country, you have internally a lot of heterogeneity. So the idea of hydrosocial territories is to create an implementation process of water infrastructure that is able to, first of all, recognize these differences and then find sort of legitimate ways of aligning them in one way or another, rather than just implementing what you think is right. And that's a complicated process. And we haven't done this with in cooperation with China so far, which is interesting, which would be interesting because, of course, Chinese technology, etc., the approach from China is, of course, different from the European one. So you've got differences there already. And then you're going into a third country, which is again different. So it needs careful management of these differences. At least we would argue that it needs that.
Okay, thank you. I have to look at the clock now because thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you, Jörg, for your lectures. And this gives me the statement, a keyword, because this spirit of water, if I may to say this, is something which touches the area of the art. Art is going with water in a social context or a mythological context, whatever. And this is the idea of our whole dialogue, to bring it together to your expert knowledge and the knowledge of the arts. And now we are very happy that we can show you this movie from China, which is dealing with these problems. But perhaps we want to, Vincent, you want to say something about the website or something?
Yeah, first I want to thank everyone once again, especially thank you our speakers, thank you our participators and the audience. for your questions and that you're following us on this third event of this Chinese-German dialogue now. And we will post the lectures as we did before on our website and send you the link by email. And if you have any further questions regarding the program or anything, just feel free to write to us.
So that means now that the official part is over of our dialogue, and the second part, we show the movie or the film Medea by SU Xiaogangzu, and the part, he's also here, and then we will discuss in German and Chinese. We will translate this, the discussion, and therefore I'm very happy that we have our translator, Mrs. Dr. Kong. She is a professor of German movies and expert on movie science from the FU Berlin. And she will make the translation then for the discussion. But I think first of all, Vincent will introduce Professor Su or Director Su, right?
Ja, sehr gerne. Und ich würde jetzt auf Deutsch wechseln, wenn das in Ordnung ist.
Ja, von mir aus.
Genau, dann möchten Sie, Frau Kong, dann schon direkt immer übersetzen. Ich mache dann einfach immer Pausen.
Okay. Ja.
Gut.
Ja.
Genau. Also, wie Thomas schon gesagt hat, sehen wir jetzt den Film Medea von Su Xiaogangzu. Su ist...
就像托马斯先生之前介绍了一下，我们马上要看到苏小刚导演的电影《Medea》。
Su ist ein bedeutender Schauspieler und auch Avantgarde-Regisseur, kann man sagen, Theaterregisseur.
苏小刚是国家一级导演，同时也是一位先锋导演，一级演员，同时也一位国家先锋导演。
Er ist Mitglied der Chinese Drama Association, Präsident der Beijing Association for Theater Development und Initiator sowie künstlerischer Leiter der 123 Theater Alliance.
苏小刚是中国戏剧家协会会员，北京戏剧艺术空间发展协会会长，123戏剧联盟邀请计划发起人、艺术总监。
Er hat als Schauspieler zusammen mit dem Regisseur Feng Jiangzhou gearbeitet und wurde auch mit einer Inszenierung nach Deutschland eingeladen, 2012 zur Kassel China Public Art Exhibition.
作为演员，他曾经跟冯小刚导演合作，并且多次受德国邀请来德国参加戏剧活动。
Als Schauspieler hat er auch mit dem berühmten Regisseur Meng Jinghui zusammengearbeitet. 2014 wurden Su und Meng mit einem Stück zum Lessing Theaterfestival nach Hamburg eingeladen.
他还跟著名的戏剧导演孟京辉合作，2014年曾经被邀请参加莱辛戏剧节。
Er trat zudem in Polen, Frankreich, Kanada und Japan auf.
他也在波兰、加拿大、日本进行演出。
Wie ich zu Anfang gesagt habe, ist Su auch Regisseur und seine Inszenierungen wurden schon vielfach zum Fringe Festival eingeladen.
同时我之前也说过，苏小刚也是一位导演，他的戏剧也多次在戏剧节上，还有戏剧节上演出。
Im letzten Jahr wurde eine Inszenierung zudem zum Wuzhen Theater Festival 2019 eingeladen, dem bedeutendsten Theaterfestival in China.
2019年，他的戏剧也在乌镇戏剧节上演出，这是中国最重要的戏剧节。
Und seine jüngste Inszenierung, Mauser von Heiner Müller, war Abschlussveranstaltung des Beijing Fringe Festivals 2019 und wurde zudem zur Contemporary Theater Biennale 2020 nach Shenzhen eingeladen.
他最新的戏剧是改编自海纳穆勒的毛瑟，他在2019年演出，并且
Contemporary Theater Biennale 2020 in Shenzhen.
他也参加了2020年深圳戏剧节。
Über Mauser haben wir uns auch kennengelernt und ich würde jetzt das Wort an Frank übergeben, der hier noch kurz etwas dazu sagen möchte.
Ja, ich freue mich sehr, dass Su Xiaogangzu jetzt dabei ist.
Ja, denk dran, dass du Pausen lässt für die Übersetzung.
Ah ja, okay.
呀，我很高兴苏小刚导演今天来到我们这里。
Wir haben uns vor 2 Jahren kennengelernt. Er rief mich an, weil er eine Inszenierung in Polen gesehen hatte von Heiner Müller auf Polnisch, von einem Stück, das er nicht kannte, aber er hatte das Gefühl, er müsste das unbedingt inszenieren und daran erkennt man schon den richtigen Künstler und hatte gehört, dass ich ein Experte wäre und er war noch einen Tag in Deutschland und fuhr dann nach Berlin, um darüber zu diskutieren.
OK， 我跟苏小刚导演是2年前认识的，那个时候我们在波兰看了海纳穆勒的这个演出毛瑟这场演出，苏小刚导演觉得这个毛瑟非常的有意思，给他很深的影响，他于是就想把毛瑟搬到中国来。然后，因为我是毛瑟这个剧的一个专家，所以说我们2个就是在那个时候就商量着合作毛瑟这部戏剧。
Ja, okay. Das war eine tolle. Achso. Ja, das war eine tolle Begegnung, weil ich jetzt ein Stück erklärt habe einem Regisseur, der noch nie etwas von Heiner Müller gelesen hatte und auch kein Stück von ihm kannte. Und ich weiß nicht, ob mir das gelungen ist. Jedenfalls hat mich der Regisseur dann nach China eingeladen, nach Peking. Und da durfte ich an der Filmakademie 2 Tage, jeweils 8 Stunden einen Vortrag halten, um das Werk von Heiner Müller zu erklären, das auch niemand kannte, gelesen hatte. Und das war auch eine ganz tolle Erfahrung und das werde ich nie vergessen.
这对我来说也是一个非常棒的体验我可以合作将海纳穆勒的剧介绍到中国，这对我来说是非常有趣的经验。我在那里待了2天，每天都工作8个小时，非常的令人振奋。Okay?
Ja. Ich habe dann in diesem Kontext an den Regisseur gedacht und ihm auch einen Text von Heiner Müller vorgeschlagen, Medea-Material, Landschaft mit Argonauten. Und als Künstler hat er dann gleich gedacht, okay, das hat was mit Wasser zu tun, also mache ich das in einem Vulkan in der Wüste. Und ich will jetzt auch gar nicht noch weiter in den Inhalt gehen. Auf jeden Fall war das sehr inspirierend und hat überhaupt diesen Mythos, Medea-Mythos nach China verlegt. Und wir können ja dann über die Einzelheiten sprechen, nachdem wir das gesehen haben.
我当时就想到了穆勒的作品《荒岸美地亚题材阿尔戈英雄风景》这部剧。我现在因为这是一个美地亚的神话，是一个西方的神话，它怎么能够搬上中国的舞台呢？这是非常有意思的。现在呢，我就不过多的讲细节了。我们一会儿看完电影之后，我们就可以再进一步的讨论。
我是平凉农村的一个地地道道的大深山的人，从小就做窑洞，没有水，就是在沟底下，就像人在这个半山上走，水就在这个山底下，上山去难，下山去更难。担一回水就要2个大木桶，那一对木桶就要50斤重，再担50斤水，担一回水就要2个小时。我们那个山区偏僻太困难了。当我高中上出来，学校上出来，这就很困难的，没办法。我就是高中一毕业，我就想再考学。我大们就说着我考，我爷就说女娃家长大了就要给人找个破家，给人给，还在上啥学呢？穷的连啥一样，吃了劲都没命呢。 姓吃啥？剩下他吃政府，姓啥姓哪？我说我没有生活了，不敢出去，一出去就不得进门。黑了商量好，人家要把我们娃要我两个要打死在那里头，说打死我残疾人打死不犯法。一个年下不灵呀呀呀生下
Ja, herzlichen Dank.
Auf jeden Fall ein Dokument, ein künstlerisches, artistisches Dokument, das unter die Haut geht, wie man so im Deutschen sagt. Vielleicht kann uns der Regisseur ein bisschen erzählen, wie diese Konzeption entstanden ist, wie auf die Idee ist, diese unglaublich karge Gegend zu nutzen und wie er zu dieser Narration gekommen ist, dieser Erzählung dieser Frau.
好，非常感谢，这么精彩的电影，这是一个非常具有艺术性的一个影片，首先您能不能苏导能不能讲一下您是怎么来构建这个故事，以中国的叙事方式来导演了这出《美狄亚》。
好，谢谢大家。
vielen Dank。
首先呢，我应该是网络的问题吧，然后影片非常的卡。
Vielleicht wegen Internetverbindung. Dieser Film ist, läuft dann nicht so, wie der Film wirklich ist.
这样的话，它就会影响整个作品的一个完整的呈现。
Deswegen wird diese Vollständigkeit dieses Films beeinflusst.
那么我呢，我是想从这个自然、环境和命运3个方面去解释美狄亚。
Im Film Medea geht es um Natur, die Umwelt und das menschliche Schicksal.
我认为，我并不认为这个事情就完全属于中国，只是我身边知道的人是这位大姐，刚好我的朋友将她介绍给我，推荐给我，所以我觉得她的经历比较符合，比较很像美狄亚的一些共同的一些经历和遭遇。
Ich habe zufälligerweise diese Frau kennengelernt durch einen Freund. Mir ist aufgefallen, dass ihr Schicksal, ihre Geschichte der Medea sehr ähnlich ist.
还有他对于命运的一种未知，就是他认为所有的不幸和遭遇都是命运带给他的。那这样的命运又是什么呢？我把命运放到了一个自然的这么一个环境下。比方说他的出身是甘肃，当时那个地方非常缺水，所以造就了他2次的婚姻，要离开那个地方，去寻找更幸福的生活。
Und sie glaubt, ihr trauriges Leben hat alles mit dem Schicksal zu tun. Also dieses Schicksal spielt eine große Rolle in ihrem Leben. Zum Beispiel, sie ist in Gansu geboren, wo es an Wasserressourcen mangelt. Das führte dazu, dass sie zweimal heiratet, um diesen Ort zu verlassen. 好的。
那么他对于美狄亚来说，美狄亚是神，可是呢，我要展现的是人，一个普普通通的人，人和神之间还是有很大的区别的。神是可以掌控自己的命运的，而人是无法掌控自我的命运的。 它一定受的外部的干涉和干扰非常的多。
好，Medea ist eine Göttinfigur. Im Vergleich zu Medea ist diese Heldin im Film ein Mensch. Eine Göttinfigur kann in gewissem Maße ihr Schicksal beherrschen, aber ein Mensch ist sehr, sehr schwach. Ihr Schicksal wird von der Umwelt, der Umgebung sehr viel beeinflusst. Es ist ihr unmöglich, ihr eigenes Schicksal zu fassen. 好的。
那么在我认为现在的神我是无从知晓的，我也不知道什么是神，但是我只知道现在科技的发展让更多的人对于自然和科技有了一种全新的认识。很多人认为自己的命运是被掌控在一种无形的一种，比方说像科技自然的手里，而自我并没有去非常想改变自己的命运。这位大姐就是这样。
Ich selber habe keine Ahnung von Gott. Ich weiß nicht, wer sich Gott versteckt und wo sich Gott versteckt und wer Gott ist. Und in unserem heutigen Leben spielt die Technologie eine wichtige Rolle. Und man denkt immer mehr darüber nach, was ist die Beziehung zwischen Technologie und Natur. Und in dieser Bedingung ist immer schwieriger, das eigene Schicksal zu beherrschen. 好的。
对，然后我认为就是片子里一再出现了两个火山，一座是被挖过的火山，一座是原始的火山。那么两个火山是有鲜明的对比的，一个是人为挖掉的，另一个还有保存的非常完好。还有大姐在行走的过程中有汽车的驶过，这一切都是在交代我们与科技、自然之间的关系，相互影响，相互渗透。
好， Im Film haben wir zwei Vulkane fotografiert. Der eine ist der vom Menschen ausgegrabene, transformierte Vulkan. Und der andere ist der ursprüngliche Vulkan ohne Transformation. Und im Film können wir auch sehen, wie die Autos an dieser Heldin vorbeifahren. Und das alles geht darum, in welcher Beziehung steht die Natur, die Menschen und das menschliche Schicksal und auch der Technologie. 好。
所以最后大姐在不停地诉说自己的痛苦和苦难的同时，我安排了一个无人机的一个镜头升高，去在拍摄。原来她所倾诉的老天，还有对她命运造成的很多不幸的老天，原来是我们现在所看到的机械、科技
啊，好。
科技。
Deswegen, als die Heldin das Schicksal weinend beklagt, wurde sie von einer UAV, also unbemannte Flugfahrzeug, gefilmt. Das heißt, sahen ihre Anschuldigungen, ihre Beklage werden von Technologie zugehört. 好。
所以我认为，当然大姐的命运也有她自我性格的一些问题，就像美迪亚也是这样的啊，她的命运也跟自我的性格有关系，所以我觉得这两者是很能贴切在一起的。所以呢，我呢就做了一版我身边的我所知道的美迪亚。
Auf der anderen Seite, das traurige Schicksal von der Heldin im Film hat auch etwas mit ihrem eigenen Charakter zu tun, was der Medea auch sehr ähnlich ist. Das ist meine Interpretation der chinesischen Medea.
好，谢谢。
好，vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Okay, danke dir. Also die Landschaft passt natürlich sehr gut zu dieser mythischen Figur, auch dieses Archaische, wie man sagt, also dass es sozusagen in die Tiefe der Zeit zurückgeht. Und mir fallen so Bilder von Pasolini-Filmen ein, der sich ja auch mit Ödipus Medea beschäftigt hat und wo die Landschaft auch immer so eine bedrohende Rolle oder so eine Ungemütlichkeit ausstrahlt und so eine Übermacht. Aber ich will das jetzt gar nicht so dominieren, das Gespräch, sondern sollen auch andere Gesprächspartner oder Anwesende ihre Fragen und Kommentare geben.
Ja, wenn ich da ganz kurz, achso, Entschuldigung.
Also ich übersetzen?
Ja, bitte.
Ja, OK，我认为片中的风景非常的有张力，特别符合这个神话它的一种意境。这让我想起帕索里尼的电影，它的风景也是有非常强的这种人性的感染力，甚至有一种威胁性的效果。但是呢，我也不想过多的说太多，我想把机会留给我的同事。好 ，OK。
Ich hatte den Eindruck, als ich das gesehen habe zum ersten Mal, dass ja auch viel aus einer gewissen Vogelperspektive aufgenommen wurde im Film, was so aus unserer westlichen Sehperspektive auch so ein bisschen so ein Gottesauge immer auch so einen Eindruck vermittelt. Und jetzt sagt er natürlich, das ist die Drohne, also auch die Technik, die da beobachtet. Im Grunde ist das vielleicht sowas auch wie Heidegger das beschreibt, dass die Technik unser Schicksal ist. Ja? Also die Technik ersetzt Gott quasi an einem gewissen Punkt inzwischen. Das war jetzt nur eine Beobachtung von mir.
我想说一个我的印象，我觉得这个片子里有很多的这种在上面的这种鸟瞰的视角，在西方来说，我们说这是一个上帝之眼的视角。这当然您之前也说过了，这是由于一个无人机的拍摄，无人机的拍摄呢，就是一个科技的一种视角，所以说这也就将科技的视角与这个人类命运牵扯上的联系，这一点我觉得很有趣。这是我的一个感觉。好，谢谢。OK，
谢谢，谢谢。
Danke。
Danke。
Ja, es gibt auch eine Frage im Chat, glaube ich, nämlich ob das vor einem Greenscreen gedreht wurde, was auf jeden Fall nicht der Fall ist, aber vielleicht kann ja Sue noch mal etwas zu dieser unglaublich besonderen Landschaft, also es sieht ja teilweise aus wie auf einem anderen Planeten, sagen, also wie er auch diesen Ort überhaupt gefunden hat und warum er sich dann dafür entschieden hat.
好，苏导能不能再跟我们介绍一下这个非常的震撼的、具有张力的这个风景？这个风景是在哪里呢？您是怎么找到这个地方的？它有什么样的意义呢？
我这个风景是在中国的内蒙古乌兰察布火山，在中国的内蒙古。
Dieser Ort befindet sich in der inneren Mongolei, China, Ulan Kap。
我当时在接到这个剧本的时候，我在思考，就是最初跟我说的是需要在海洋的一个背景下，于是我每天都在思考。有一天呢，我和我的一个好朋友我们两个在一起吃饭，我把这个事情告诉他，他说：“那你为什么一定要去海洋呢？那海洋就是海洋是最初地球的所有的环境，就是一个完整的海洋。那么海洋之后又有什么呢？我说有地面，然后呢，我说还有火山。他说我知道一个内蒙古的地方有一座火山群，于是我们就奔到那儿去看了。看了之后，我就觉得特别像，尤其那个火山的中央是有一个眼睛，我就觉得特别像神祭祀，像一个地球之眼。那就是海洋最初的地方。谢谢。
好。Okay. Ja, zuerst als ich dieses Stück gelesen hatte, dachte ich mir, ich würde diesen Film am Meer drehen, also am Ufer, am Meer, an der Küste. Aber einmal habe ich mit meinem Freund zum Mittag gegessen und er hat mir vorgeschlagen, warum unbedingt am Meer? Es gibt doch Erde, die Erde und Vulkan. Vulkan ist sehr hat große Kraft, hat große ist sehr beeindruckend. Ja, dann fahren wir zu diesem Ort, wo er vorgeschlagen hat und hat diesen Vulkan gefunden. Dieser Vulkan hat mich sehr fasziniert und interessanterweise habe ich gesehen, mitten in diesem Vulkan gibt es ein großes Loch. Das ist genauso wie Augen der Erde. Das finde ich total interessant. Deswegen habe ich diesen Ort als ausgewählt. Ja. Okay.
Ja, es gibt auch ein Stück von Hölderlin, Empedokles, das spielt auch im Zusammenhang mit einem Vulkan. Das ist sicherlich noch nicht übersetzt, nehme ich an, aber das Goethe-Institut kann das ja mal übersetzen. Das wäre sicherlich auch ein sehr interessantes Sujet. Ich will noch einen Satz sagen nur. Diese Formel, die Technik ist unser Schicksal. Ich weiß gar nicht, ob das in der Prägnanz von Heidegger ist, aber auf jeden Fall hat es in dieser Prägnanz Heiner Müller gesagt. Und das sind die unheimlichen Antennen von Su, der diesen Satz gar nicht kennen kann, der das sozusagen auch irgendwo erfasst hat mit seinen Antennen.
Entschuldigung, können Sie noch einmal diesen Ansatz von Heidegger?
Was gerade Thomas gesagt hatte, ist ja, die Technik ist unser Schicksal. Und diese Formulierung, die hat auf jeden Fall in dieser Prägnanz als Formel, hat es Heiner Müller gesagt. Und Su kennt diesen Satz gar nicht, hat aber sozusagen mit seinen Antennen oder intuitiv, mit seiner großen Sensibilität erfasst, worum es darum gehen könnte bei Heiner Müller.
Ja, 这个科技是我们的命运，这一点呢是那个海纳穆勒在一个他的一个语言，他说苏导肯定是不知道这句话的，然而他用自己的这种感知、自己的敏感，在他的电影中也表达了相似的一个观点。好。
好，最后我这部影片，我还是要感谢和我一起合作的2位艺术家，还有诸多的主创，一位是北京非常优秀的做视觉艺术的陈旭仁，还有一位是平面设计，现在也在做这个各种艺术设计的聂静竹，这2位帮助我完成了这部剧。还有一位就是我的好朋友哈德斯先生也认识薛宗阔在文本上他帮我提了很多关于你比方说有3个人穿病号服的3个人，还有羊群，他跟我说这三和羊对于西方来说是非常重要的。
Ich möchte mich auch bei 3 Künstlern bedanken, nämlich Herr Chen Xu Ren ist ein Vision-Künstler und Nie Jingzhu und nicht zuletzt Xue Zongkuo, der auch in Frankreich Philosophie studiert hat und mir viele tatkräftige Unterstützung gegeben hat. Zum Beispiel, er hat mir vorgeschlagen, 3 Personen in Patientenuniform gekleidet. Er hat gesagt, 3 hat eine besondere Bedeutung in der westlichen Kultur. Und auch wurde dieser Schaf auf dem Berg gefilmt. Und 3 und Schaf, diese 2 Elemente sind sehr interessante und bedeutende Elemente in der Religion. Okay.
Okay. Ich glaube, Sie hatten noch mal einen Hinweis auf Hölderlin, Tod des Empedokles, vergessen. Das sind so eine Tragödie, Fragmente einer Tragödie, die auch in einem Vulkan spielen. Ich will ihn nur neugierig machen. ein Stück von Hölderlin. Hölderlin ist der Autor. Fragmentarische Tragödie, Tod des Empedokles, spielt in einem Vulkan. Der Vulkan ist ganz wichtig und vielleicht erweckt das ja seine Neugier.
还有荷尔德林的作品中也是经常会出现火山这个意象，所以说火山对于戏剧作品来说，或者是我们西方文化也是非常有趣的一种比喻，只是作为一个补充。
好，最后一句，它是一部戏剧。我认为我自己拍的是一部戏剧，不是一个电影。
Zum Letzten möchte ich noch mal behaupten, ich halte Medea für ein Drama, für ein Theater, nicht gerade einen Film. 好的。
好，谢谢。
Vielen Dank.
Wir bleiben dem Theater treu.
他说您忠诚于戏剧。
Ja, wunderbar. Grüße an den Dramaturgen. Vielleicht, Thomas, möchtest du noch ein Schlusswort sagen? Oder?
Also Herr Niewöhner hatte eben auch noch eine Frage.
So,
ich weiß nicht, ob sich das schon erledigt hat.
Herr Niewöhner,
ja, vielleicht gibt es noch ein Wort der Hoffnung. Ich hatte so den Eindruck, die Technik ist unser Schicksal und wird uns aber nicht retten. Das ist ja so der Technikpessimismus von Heidegger. Die Gesellschaft sieht auch eher passiv aus und die Natur ist auch unerbittlich in Form dieses kargen Vulkans. Wo ist denn dann die Hoffnung für uns? Also wer kümmert sich um den Menschen?
Schafe.
OK，最后我想问一个希望的问题，比如刚才在电影里面也表达了，科技是我们的命运这个主题，但是科技呢最终也没有拯救我们，一切都是非常的消极，同时自然也扮演着一个不能给人以安慰的角色。那我就在想，这个希望是在哪里？
我的戏剧观是，戏剧是提问题的，制造话题的，它并没有结果。我觉得结果在于各位科学家，在于各位艺术家，在于各位地球上普普通通的任何一个人，我们共同一起去寻找答案吧，而不在于一部作品或者是一部电影里。
Meiner Meinung nach besteht die Aufgabe des Theaters nicht darin, Antwort zu geben oder Hoffnung zu geben, sondern zum Nachdenken, zur Selbstreflexion anzuregen. Also was uns retten kann, ist nur uns selber, ist nur die Menschen selbst. 好 ，OK。
Ja, bei Heiner Müller heißt es arbeiten und nicht verzweifeln. Heiner Müller sagt arbeiten und nicht verzweifeln.
他补充了一下，海纳穆勒的说过，工作就可以了，不要去怀疑。
好
OK，
谢谢。我们还有一句话。工作就是回家，工作就是为了回家。
Wir haben auch ein Sprichwort: Arbeiten, um nach Hause zu gehen. Arbeiten bedeutet zu Hause. Okay.
Das ist ja fast wie Odysseus. Okay, fertig zurück.
Ja, hier sind noch zwei Anmerkungen im Chat. Kann ich vielleicht noch kurz was zu sagen? Also einmal, das ist keine Frage, sondern ein Verweis, dass laut I ist der Name, die Natur eine heilende Funktion hat. Darüber kann man natürlich diskutieren, aber das führt vielleicht jetzt zu weit auch weg. Und dann wollte ich noch Frau Maria Zinoni fragen, ob ihre Frage schon beantwortet wurde. Das wurde ja schon kurz angesprochen, was es mit den 3 Figuren auf sich hat, oder wollten Sie da noch mal genauer nachfragen?
刚才那个提了一个问题，说这个自然一直是有一个治愈的功能，就问一下有没有这个问题有没有在刚才讨论中被解答？然后Maria Victoria Tinoni 他讲是的，刚刚已经被解答了。Okay. Thomas, hast du noch eine zweite Frage?
Ich wollte nur noch fragen, inwiefern der Heiner Müller-Text, den wir ja auch übersetzt haben, dann ins Chinesische, hat der inspiriert oder gab es diese Kenntnis von Medea schon vorher in einem anderen Zusammenhang?
好，说到托马斯问的问题是，海纳穆勒的这个原著是怎么给予了您灵感，或者说这个美迪亚这个想法，这个角色，您早就是想做这方面的东西。
我一直挺关注命运的，我一直觉得就是我们的生活，我们的人生到底是什么让我们遭受了一些痛苦和不幸呢？所以我一直挺关注这个事情的。我认为美迪亚就是一种，我无从解释他为什么会所有的事情都发生在了他的身上，所有的不幸。所以呢，我觉得穆勒的作品不光是这一部，包括我之前排的《毛色》，对于我来说都是一个在探讨人为什么会遭受这样苦难的一个问题啊，所以我才会在身边去寻找。
Ich interessiere mich immer für die Frage Schicksal. Was ist das Schicksal? Und zum Beispiel Medias trauriges Schicksal lässt sich gar nicht erklären, warum alle schlechte Dinge ihr passiert. Warum? Und Heiner Müller nicht nur dieses Werk von Heiner Müller, sondern auch andere Werke von Heiner Müller haben mich sehr interessiert, weil er konfrontiert mit seinen Werken schonungslos, stark, scharf gesellschaftliche Probleme, zum Beispiel Mause. Und deswegen, ich frage, warum wurde dem Menschen solche Qual, solche traurige, grausame Schicksal antut. Dann zufälligerweise habe ich diese Heldin, das ist eine also keine Schauspielerin, sondern eine normale Mensch, normale Frau kennengelernt. Und habe ich von ihrem Schicksal erfahren, wurde ich auch von ihr inspiriert. Okay.
Also auf jeden Fall möchte ich mich auch nochmal ganz herzlich bedanken für dieses eindrucksvolle Stück, was er da jetzt neu inszeniert hat und auch die Neuinterpretation des Medea-Mythos, was für mich persönlich auch eine, sage ich mal, neue Erfahrung war, ästhetische Erfahrung war. Also dafür ganz herzlichen Dank.
总之，我要非常衷心的感谢这一部非常具有美感和非常具有力量的影片，它给我们开启了一种新的审美体验，引发我们思考。Okay.
谢谢。
Gut, wenn wir sonst keine Fragen mehr haben, steht nur noch ganz kurz ein Kommentar. Großartige Theodizee-Version von Medea, mehr konzentriert auf Leidenschaft statt Revanche. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Vielleicht können wir das noch übersetzen als eine Art Schlusswort im Chat.
最后我们要翻译一句来自于聊天的一个感受。非常棒的，对于这个 Theodizee ist doch ein griechischer Regisseur, ja? 非常棒的，对于希腊导演这个美迪亚的一种改编。而我认为他这改编更多的是关注于这种激情、这种痛苦，而不是复仇。非常感谢。
Theodizee.
Ich kann auch selbst auf Chinesisch erklären
Ja.
und Bedanken erzählen. 就是大家您好，我非常高兴能看到这部影片。我自己是来自内蒙古的一个在德国交换的学生，然后非常 震撼于您这个神议论的视角。本身美迪亚可能一开始期待的是一个复仇主题，但是看到您更多在苦难和命运主題上面，就是一个非常棒的呈現，就是非常感謝。Das war's. Also theoretische Version war ein philosophischer Begriff, den ich nicht die Übersetzerin stören möchte. Vielen Dank dafür.
Okay. Genau.
Ich bin eine Austauschstudentin aus der Mongolei und ich bin von diesem Film sehr beeindruckt. Anstatt sich auf Rechen zu konzentrieren, enthält in diesem Film eher qualvolles Schicksal. Das finde ich sehr interessant. Vielen Dank.
Ja. Und dann noch der letzte Kommentar. Fragt sich, was Natur im Anthropozän überhaupt bedeutet, schreibt Herr Niewöhner, aber das braucht vielleicht eine weitere Dialogsitzung, was wir hoffen, dann auch zu realisieren im nächsten Jahr. Also im Chat steht das, ne?
Okay.
Die Frage, was bedeutet Natur im Anthropozän? Also.
还有一个在聊天中问题就是，这个自然在人类学的这种角度是到底什么意思？当然，这可能是属于另外的这个讨论的范畴。
Okay. Gut, ich möchte mich auch noch mal ganz herzlich bedanken bei meiner Kollegin Frau Liu Juye. Die hat nämlich den Heiner Müller-Text vom Deutschen ins Chinesische übersetzt, was sicher auch eine ganz besondere Erfahrung für sie war. Nicht? Also sowohl grammatisch als auch emotional. Dafür noch mal ganz herzlichen Dank.
最后他将这个穆勒的穆勒的作品从德语翻译成中文，这对他来说也是一个非常有趣的体验。谢谢。
Und bei dir, Kongkong, möchte ich mich auch nochmal bedanken fürs Dolmetschen. Ich hatte vorhin vergessen zu erwähnen, dass du ja auch promoviert hast über das Thema Migrationsfilme aus Deutschland als Medium interkultureller Erziehung und Bildung. Ja, du hast darüber an der TU Berlin promoviert und ich denke, dieser Migrationsaspekt passt ja eigentlich auch ganz gut zum Medea-Stoff im weitesten Sinne.
Ja, stimmt.
Das ist ja auch eine Migrantin.
谢谢，不客气。他说要okay. Ich brauche das vielleicht nicht übersetzen.
Nee, ist okay, das ist persönlich, genau. Und dann danke ich auch nochmal den Kollegen, also oder Referenten, Professor Niewöhner und Professor Li für ihre wirklich informativen und auch inspirierenden Vorträge heute und auch für die anregende Diskussion, die dadurch entstanden ist. Vielen
最后
Dank
非常
nochmal.
感谢Niewöhner 教授还有李教授非常精彩的报告，感谢各位的参加。
Und danke auch nochmal an alle Teilnehmer und auch Zugeschalteten heute für das Interesse und auch für die Teilnahme. Ich hoffe, dass wir uns im kommenden Jahr dann wiedersehen mit neuen Themen oder auch mit Fortsetzungen dieser Dialogreihe. Und ich wünsche Ihnen und euch einen schönen Tag in Deutschland und noch einen angenehmen Abend. Wichtig ist natürlich auch das Essen in China, ne? Und das ist ja auch ein Teil zum Glück, der zum Glück führt. Also nochmal vielen Dank und alles Gute.
最后非常感谢参加的各位讨论以及有趣的问题。我非常期待明年我们还可以继续来进行这个有趣的系列活动。最后预祝大家有一个愉快的一天，还有一个舒适的夜晚。也许中国的同事们今天应该吃饭了，然后吃饭也是美食也是属于幸福的一个重要的组成部分。
Also, danke. Tschüss, 再见。
再见，
bis bald.
再见。
Tschüss.
好，再见。
Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Dankeschön.
Ciao. Tschüss.